Right, revision session 5, trench medicine. I'm not going to go through the previous format of 11AS and changing continuity and all that. It's not really relevant. There's a different set of questions for, this is section A, the environment study, this trench medicine, so it will be the first set of questions. The first 3 questions that you answer in the exam will be about this, and they are pretty unique. In the next revision session, when I look at exam questions, I'll spend some separate time on the trench medicine questions. But this is just for knowledge. This is just the sort of stuff you need to know. Okay, so we'll begin with trench warfare generally, and then we'll have a look at the Royal Army Medical Corps and the first aid nursing yeomanry, or the FANI, usually enough. And then we'll look at conditions in the trenches, illness, wounds and injuries that you were likely to pick up, and then treatments and developments in treatment. So this is really the equivalent of changing continuity. Okay, so starting with the overview of the trench warfare, you should know it's basic stuff really. The fighting went on in France and Belgium, on the Western Front that is. France and Belgium. There's a line of trenches that extended all the way from the North Sea, English Channel sort of area, all the way down to Switzerland, with the Germans on the eastern side, and the French, British and Belgians on the western side. We've got some salient points, some big events that you need to be aware of. The Battle of the Somme was 1916, famous for 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, a third of which were deaths. So 20,000 dead, 60,000 casualties just on the first day. We've also got the Second Battle of Ypres, 1915, which is when you had the first gas attack. The Battle of Arras is notable because it was when tunnels were dug under the German trenches and mines were exploded. Mines are underground tunnels filled with explosive. Ammonite is the explosive that they used. And they were dug by engineers whose name was sappers. They were called sappers, the engineers who dug the tunnels underneath the German trenches. A famous mine was the one at Messines Ridge, killed 10,000 Germans instantly. 10,000 Germans instantly. It was the largest single explosion up until the first atomic bomb. We've got other famous mines that were dug. Hill 60 was a famous mine, and the Caterpillar was another famous mine as well. Okay, so we've got some battles and events that you need to be aware of as being. You really need to know them because they were the occasion on which specific injuries or wounds were picked up. So wounds that were the result of mines or explosive, particularly devastating explosions, or wounds or damage to the human body that was the result of gas attacks, which is why the Battle of Ypres is important. Okay. You need to be aware of why the trenches were designed the way they were in that zigzag pattern. So there's a diagram there in front of you. You can see the zigzags that were used. That was to kind of stop the explosion from ripping all along the line. If you think about it, there was no sort of straight line in the trench. It wouldn't go on for any length of time before a kind of zigzag got in the way, and that was to deaden any explosion so that it would only kill a few men in the trench rather than wiping out hundreds in one go. That was the idea. So you've got different sections of the trench, reinforced with sandbags. The breastwork be the front of the trench. The front line trench was the one right facing the enemy, right on no man's land. This was the fire trench. It was called the fire trench because it would be where you would provide firing upon the enemy from. The support trench would be 60 to 90 metres behind, so that's like your second line trench. And communication trenches were what linked the two. So you wouldn't have to get out of the trench to get to the front line trench. You'd walk along a communication trench, and then 350 metres further behind, you'd have the reserve trench. So relatively safe in the reserve trench, and you'd cycle through. You'd spend a couple of days in the reserve trench, a couple of days in the support trench, and then a couple of days really under the cosh in the front line trench. And then you'd rotate back again and maybe have a couple of days leave in a camp behind the lines, and then the whole cycle would start again. Trenches would be 6 or 7 feet deep. They'd be lined with duck boards. so they wouldn't. The idea was that they wouldn't get too muddy. Didn't really work, particularly in third battle of Ypres, or otherwise known as Passchendaele, was famously muddy. Men drowned in the mud at Passchendaele. You've got the firing step that you would stand on to fire over the top of the trench if you were a sniper. No man's land is the line. It is the land between the two trenches. Trenches were organised in parallel lines, for support. And the kind of terrain that you're on, well, it varied to begin with. In 1914, it wasn't quite as beat up as it was by 1918. By 1918, it was covered in shell holes, pock-marked and horrible. Horse-drawn carts would have trouble navigating this terrain, and then we got motorised ambulances, but they were unreliable. This kind of technology is still in its infancy in 1914. Cars are only like 20 years old by that time, so they're not the most reliable of things. Railways were used. Railways were built, diverted, so that they could supply the front line. Stretcher bearers had to walk along this terrain in order to meet the needs of the chain of evacuation, and that's the key word that we're interested in, the chain of evacuation. You may well be asked to describe the chain of evacuation, and there's a small diagram there at the bottom of that slide. That is the chain of evacuation. Okay, so there's some key words there, and all about the trench system and what it was, the background really to trench warfare and trench medicine. So moving on to some specifics, we've got the Royal Army Medical Corps. Okay, the Royal Army Medical Corps. This was a specific branch of the army that dealt with medical issues. So if you were a doctor in the army, you would be part of the Royal Army Medical Corps, and you'd be assigned to a particular battalion. You'd be their medical officer. So they found the number of casualties overwhelming. For example, the Battle of the Somme, 60,000 in one day, as we've said. Moving casualties was difficult because of the mud. Field ambulances existed. Now, field ambulances is a bit of variation in field ambulances. You've got field ambulances that were kind of pretty much static. Don't think of an ambulance as kind of what we use ambulances for. They wouldn't be sort of gnawing up and down the road to get people to and from hospital. Field ambulances were really kind of like the hub of a dressing station, for example. They would be fairly close to the lines, or they would be shuttling casualties, but they'd be taking them from dressing stations and casualty clearing stations back to base hospitals. So they weren't like zooming up and down, in the battle. They were exposed to shell fire because some enemy shells had a longer range. So some ambulance drivers were shelled, wounded, even killed, but by and large they weren't exposed to front line fire. But there were two kinds of field ambulances. Some field ambulances were pretty much static. Other field ambulances were kind of used to move wounded to between base hospitals. So we've got relay posts, stages in the chain of evacuation, and these were, stretcher bearers would be used for this. Stretcher bearers were members of the RAMC. Quite often they were conscientious objectors, men who didn't want to carry a rifle, so they agreed to be stretcher bearers. They would carry the wounded, try and save lives rather than take them. So they would begin from a regimental aid post. So this was very close to the front lines, pretty much in the front lines, and that would be the place where the regimental medical officer was based, very close to the front line. After a battle or during a battle, this would be the first port of call for the stretcher bearers. The first point in the chain of evacuation would be the regimental aid post. 350 metres behind the front line, you'd have the advanced dressing station, which is exactly what you would expect it to be, dressing wounds. And there'd be triage going on all the way along this chain of evacuation. Medical orderlies would be assessing, doctors, if they were available, would be assessing wounds to see whether they needed immediate treatment, whether they could wait, whether they were just being made comfortable because there was nothing that could be done for them, whether they needed to be moved back further along the chain of evacuation. to the next stage, which will be the casualty clearing station. This will be a couple of miles behind the line, okay, supported by nursing staff, okay, and X-ray units. Still pretty intense, you know, a lot of hustle and bustle, a lot of blood, a lot of unpleasantness, but no real danger of shelling, no real danger of attack in any sense. Okay, and then the final stage in the chain of evacuation will be the base hospital. Up to 400 patients, close to railways. Some of these different some base hospitals specialised in different wounds. For example, you might have a base hospital that specialised in the treatment of gas wounds, or explosions, or bullet wounds, or whatever. Okay, so that's your basic introduction to the RAMC and the chain of evacuation. Know the stages in the chain of evacuation. Regimental aid post, advanced dressing station, casualty clearing station, and base hospitals. Then you've got first aid nursing yeomanry, the fannies. These were vets, nurses, signallers, drivers. Often includes entertainments and soup kitchens and canteens. Pretty broad umbrella, really, the fanny. Mainly used for field ambulance drivers, 2 convoys, Calais convoy and Saint-Omer. Yeah, 2 famous convoys. Field ambulances. I mentioned that some of the field ambulances were static, but those that weren't would shuttle between base hospitals and casualty clearing stations, and also to the ports where soldiers would be put on the ships to go home if they were badly wounded or deserving of some rest and recuperation. The Calais convoy and the Saint-Omer convoy. Okay. So be aware of your first aid nurse and yeomanry, the kind of jobs that they did. Be prepared to use that kind of language in your exam. Conditions in trenches. So it wasn't just wounds that the RAMC and the fanny were called to deal with. It was also the fallout from the conditions in there. So mud would quite often lead to trench foot. So trench foot needed treating. Ice and flooding, etc. damaged the skin and caused all kinds of illnesses. Trench fever, for example. Dirty water, so you could get cholera. You could get all sorts of horrible diseases, dysentery from the poor conditions. Rats, of course, carried horrible diseases. Lice, people needed delousing. And the stench, the rotting corpses, all that horrible stuff. Also, not a great deal of understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder, but towards the end of the war, a greater understanding of what was called shell shock. So some attempt among some more sympathetic medical staff to treat what was known as shell shock. Illnesses, wounds, injuries, the kind of thing that the kind of wounds that people got. A big one would be gas. Okay, we've mentioned that gas was first used at the Second Battle of Ypres. Know that that's when it happened. It was in April 1915, the first Battle of Ypres, and the gas that was used was chlorine gas. Okay, chlorine gas was used. It was a suffocating agent. It would starve the victim of oxygen, and it was used by the Germans first. And of course, the British said it was a terrible thing and just not cricket, and you should never do that. And then we did it. And we used phosgene gas, December 1915, colourless, almost odourless, and took 24 hours for symptoms to begin. It was wind dependent, though. You could only use it when the wind was blowing in the right direction. There are examples of the taps. It was gas taps. There are examples of the gas being turned on, the taps being loosened, and the gas making its way across the no man's land towards the enemy, and then the wind changing direction and blowing it back on the people that had let the gas out in the first place. So it wasn't 100% reliable. So we've got chlorine and phosgene, and then we've also got mustard gas, which probably the most famous gas, not used until July 1917. Mustard gas would blister the skin, burn the eyes, could take 5 weeks to die, and it clung to your clothes, so it was dangerous for medics too. Okay. Okay, back to it. We've got Oh yeah, emotional trauma, shell shock I've mentioned, mental breakdown from the repeated stress of being bombarded, gunfire and shell explosions, fractures, these are the kind of wounds that people would get, fractures, bruises. At the start of the war, if you got a compound fracture, that means a compound fracture is where the bone is sticking out of your skin, you would almost certainly die. It was a compound fracture, well, it depended on the bone, I suppose. Compound fracture of the femur was almost always fatal. But an example of improved medicine, war is the quite often impetus to improvements. And by the end of the war, because there were so many wounds like that, I suppose, doctors got better at treating it. Blood transfusions we were able to practice on people who had those kind of wounds. X-ray units were used all the time, but that's something I'll come on to in a minute. But be aware of fractures as a big issue as a result of shell explosions. Organ damage also, obviously being hit by shrapnel. So bad was that at the start of the war, soldiers just wore sort of soft caps, but as the war progressed, well, quite early on in the war, they were issued with Brody helmets as an effort to try and stop certain wounds to the head, unnecessary deaths from head wounds. So Brody helmets were introduced. Shrapnel, sort of white hot, spinning, jagged lumps of metal that come from shells. Shells were designed specifically to scatter shrapnel across a wide area. Other injuries from explosions could be concussion or buried alive, or simply blood poisoning from infected. If you think about it, after a couple of years fighting on the Western Front, the mud was poisonous. It was fetid, rotting, horrible mud that was covered in the germs from dead bodies and animals and rats and all kinds of horrible things. So if you got some of that horrible mud in a wound, then quite often you would get horrible gangrene, nasty disease in your wound. So that was remember, this is in the days before penicillin, so this, quite a lot of deaths from infections as well. Okay, moving on to that kind of thing. Infections, we've got gas gangrene. Now that's not gangrene that you get from gas. That's gangrene in your leg. It sort of fills up and becomes blistered and stinks. So that's gas gangrene. Tetanus was a big problem as well. Nowadays you get vaccinated against tetanus, but it's a blood infection. Fertilizers on farmland get into the skin. That would be getting into wounds would be bad. Bacteria, as I mentioned, from the filthy mud, decomposing corpses in the mud and all that. If that gets in your wound, it's curtains really. Unhygienic latrines. Remember, there's no penicillin. The only preventions for infection were the anti-tetanus serum, or BIP, as it became known, which was a paraffin paste, carbolic spray, which is what Joseph Lister used in surgery. Okay, but again, as I've said, war is kind of like the mother of invention, and necessity is the mother of invention, and war is quite often something that moves things along quite quickly. So a lot of experimentation went on during World War I with the treatment of wounds. So wounds were sewn up as quickly as possible to try and prevent infection. This was called primary closure. Now, there was some, as I said, there was some experimentation that went on with ways to improve that approach. We'll look at some of those now. Okay, so those are the kind of wounds that you would get. The last column I'm going to look at now is treatment and developments in treatment. Okay, as I've said, war is something that quite often spurs on developments in medicine, and we can see some evidence of that, some examples of that, and it's good. It would be really good if you can have some of those examples to hand and know some of the names of the individuals who were involved in that as well. Okay, so improvements. There were 379 medical officers at the Third Battle of Ypres. So we're getting on to like 1917 now with the Third Battle of Ypres. So more wounded could be treated. They'd learned that they needed more medical officers. They needed more doctors around. So they had 379 at the Third Battle of Ypres, so more wounded could be treated. As I mentioned, there were experiments with treating wound infection. So we've got this fella, Antoine Depage. He prevented wound infection by treating every wound as though it was already infected. Okay, so he delayed primary closure. Okay, if he just assumed that every wound he treated was infected, he didn't sew it up immediately. He delayed primary closure, cleaned it, swabbed it out, left it for 24 hours, gave it a sniff to see if it was infected, and if it was all right, then he closed it. If it wasn't, it would need further treatment, it would need further cleaning. So yeah, by delaying primary closure, Antoine Depage actually improved the treatment of infected wounds. And then a pair of doctors called Carroll and Dakin, that's their surnames, Carroll and Dakin, improved this further by flushing the wounds with antiseptic solution. This is called irrigation. Okay, so if you treat every wound as though it is, you just assume every wound is infected, you delay primary closure, and then you irrigate that wound with antiseptic solution, it's going to reduce the deaths from infection. Okay? But remember, we've still not got penicillin. We don't get penicillin for another 10 years after World War I. So this is the best treatment for wound infection. Antoine Depage and Carroll and Dakin. So developments in fracture treatment. Remember Wilhelm Röntgen invented the X-ray in 1895. So we've got X-ray units, mobile X-ray units, 14 of them. They basically look like massive ambulances. At the start of the war, 80% of femur fractures were fatal. Okay, a new invention by Dr. Thomas, the Thomas splint, worked alongside X-rays to improve survival. By the end of the war, only 20% of femur fractures were fatal. So this is a development. These are developments that were specifically for the treatment of wounds in World War I that actually ended up saving lives beyond war. Okay, so that improved treatment in infections, delayed primary closure and irrigation. It helped in World War I, but it was also taken back home to Britain, to Germany, all over the world, and actually helped treatment in not in war, theatres of war. And it's the same with this Thomas splint, which reduced deaths from femur fractures. And perhaps one of the most famous areas of development coming from World War I was in the area of blood transfusions. Major loss of blood was a major cause of death in 1914. We were able to transfuse blood. We knew about transfusions. Karl Landsteiner was the guy who identified different blood groups. Landsteiner, not on your sheet there, Landsteiner. And we knew about different blood groups, but blood transfusion happened directly from the donor to the recipient, and it could be slow, and it needed someone there to have fresh blood taken from. So, nowadays we use a blood bank, and this idea of a blood bank was developed during the Battle of Cambrai, which was a famous tank battle, and it was set up by a doctor, Captain Robertson, and he was the guy who first came up with the idea of storing blood ready to be used, which is a simple idea, but it's really effective. So storing blood ready to be used, and that saved lives as well. So important developments as a result of World War I. War is a horrible thing, but sometimes some good inventions and good ideas come out of it. So higher level detail, a salient. A salient is a strip of land that sticks out into the enemy territory. Ypres itself was a salient, so it kind of bulged out, almost surrounded on all sides in a salient. The Hindenburg Line was a strongly reinforced line of German defences. Captain Robertson, as I've said, is the guy who came up with the idea of the blood bank. Carroll and Dakin are the guys who came up with the idea of irrigating wounds with antiseptic solution. Antoine Depage is the guy who came up with delayed primary closure. The Thomas splint improved mortality rates from femur fractures. BIP was a kind of paraffin paste that was used as an antiseptic. Primary closure, as I said, is this mistaken belief that you're protecting the wound by closing it up as quickly as possible, which is great unless there's already an infection in there, in which case you're making things a lot worse. The Brodie helmet was issued to all soldiers in the British Army to protect against head wounds. The chain of evacuation, know your orders, okay, know that it goes from regimental aid post, advanced dressing stations, casualty clearance stations, and base hospitals. And gas gangrene is like a horrible infection that you get in your wounds. Okay, that's everything. Next one will be on how to answer different questions.